There is a moment in every shipping warehouse when two packages that look identical stop having the same future. Same weight, same cardboard, same tape, same conveyor belt, same fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. And then one tiny printed label decides everything. One box goes to a quiet neighborhood and gets opened at a kitchen table with a smile. The other gets bounced through 3 states, misread twice, dropped in the wrong truck, and spends the next week becoming a problem no one meant to buy. Money works like that. Not because $1 is virtuous and the other dollar is reckless. Not because borrowed money is cursed and earned money is pure. Not because rich people have access to some magical green paper the rest of the world never sees. A dollar is neutral cargo. It does not care where it came from. It only obeys where it was already told to go. And most people miss the most important part of that sentence. Already. Before you feel proud of it, before you feel guilty about it, before you rationalize it, before your phone lights up with a sale, before your friend sends the reservation link, before your landlord, your appetite, your boredom, your insecurity, or your panic get a vote. By the time most people are asking, should I be better with money? The useful question was earlier. Where was this dollar headed before I even touched it? That is the whole game. Because if a dollar arrives with no forwarding address, the world will happily assign one for you. Convenience will volunteer, urgency will volunteer, status will volunteer. The app with the prettiest button will absolutely volunteer. And strangely enough, your own good intentions are usually the weakest volunteer in the room. That sounds harsh, but it should actually feel relieving. If the problem were that you are secretly lazy, weak, unserious, or born without discipline, that would be terrible news. But if the problem is routing, then routing can be fixed. You do not need to become a saint. You need to become an address clerk. You need to decide upstream what this money is for before life starts shouting over you. And to see how big that difference gets, we need to look at the same law in 2 places people usually keep separate: debt and paycheck money. Because people talk about them like they belong to different moral universes. Borrowed money is dramatic. Earned money feels respectable. One sounds dangerous. The other sounds safe. But they behave under the exact same rule.
If the destination is productive, both can build. If the destination is consumptive, both can disappear. Same cargo, different forwarding address. Start with debt, because this is where people get emotional fast. The phrase good debt annoys people because it sounds like a banker trying to flirt with your common sense. And fair enough, a lot of nonsense has been smuggled through that phrase. So forget the phrase. Use a cleaner test. When this borrowed dollar lands, does it go somewhere that grows, throws off cash, lowers future friction, or gets quietly eroded by time and inflation while the asset remains useful? Or does it go somewhere that gets consumed before the bill even fully settles into your nervous system? That is the test. Not, was the interest rate impressive? Not, did the person explaining it sound confident? Not, did it make you feel like a main character for 6 minutes? Does the dollar arrive at an asset, or does it arrive at appetite? That is the whole argument. Think about real estate leverage in its healthiest form. Not the fantasy version, where someone buys 3 properties by age 26, films themselves pointing at countertops, and calls granite a wealth strategy. The boring version. A fixed loan is attached to a property that produces rent, or saves you from paying rent elsewhere, while inflation slowly makes yesterday's debts smaller in tomorrow's dollars. The debt did not become magical. It was simply routed into something that could keep standing there and doing work after the excitement was over. The borrowed dollar did not vanish at checkout. It got stationed. That is different. Or take an SBA loan used to buy a functioning small business. Again, not the internet fantasy version, where every dry cleaner is somehow a hidden mint, and every buyer is one spreadsheet away from private jet energy. The real version. You use debt to acquire a business with existing cash flow, real customers, and systems that can keep producing after the acquisition closes. Now the borrowed money lands inside a machine that has at least a chance to pay you back while still existing. That does not remove risk. It does something more important. It names the job. This debt is not here to entertain me. It is here to acquire cash flow. That sentence alone saves people from a shocking amount of nonsense. Because a lot of financial regret is just money doing a job it was never formally assigned to do.
Then there is the strange rich person move that sounds fake until you study it long enough.
Build or buy assets. Let them appreciate. Then borrow against the assets instead of selling them. The logic underneath buy, borrow, die is not that rich people discovered a cheat code hidden under a velvet curtain. The logic is routing. The asset stays alive. The borrowed cash arrives as usable liquidity. And because the destination of the original dollars was productive in the first place, the pile you can borrow against may keep compounding, while the newer debt solves a separate need. Now, obviously, this is not your starter kit move. This is not something a person with 3 subscriptions, a car note, and emotional support takeout should hear and translate into, "Great, debt is freedom now." That would be like hearing that surgeons use knives professionally and deciding your kitchen has entered a new era. The point is narrower. Wealthy systems keep sending dollars toward assets that remain alive long enough to create new options. Poor systems keep sending dollars toward things that die before the statement arrives. Same motion, different destination. Look at fixed debt during inflation. When you lock in cheap long-term debt and your income, prices, or asset values rise over time, inflation can quietly sand down the real burden of what you owe. Again, the debt itself is not the hero. Time is helping because the debt was assigned a survivable seat. It was strapped to an asset or to a stable plan, not to a weekend urge wearing premium branding. And then there is deductible investment debt, which sounds dry until you realize dry is often where money becomes beautiful. If borrowing costs are tied to producing taxable investment outcomes, some of that friction can be reduced. Not erased, reduced. That matters because rich systems do not just ask, "How do I get more return?" They ask, "How do I route the cost itself into a lane where some of the pain gets softened by structure?" That is a sophisticated sentence, but the instinct is simple. Where is this dollar going, and what ecosystem surrounds it once it gets there? Now flip the whole thing. Same borrowed dollar, same bank, same approval screen, different destination. Luxury car beyond the real budget. Furniture financed because patience felt humiliating. Vacation upgraded because economy was psychologically offensive. Random balances quietly rolled into a bigger balance because future me is apparently a talented hostage negotiator. Here is what makes consumption debt so lethal. It creates the emotional experience of expansion, while routing the money into something that starts shrinking the second the excitement peaks. The consumption happens up front. The bill keeps happening afterward. So now the borrowed dollar is gone, but the claim on your future income remains very alive. That is not just expensive. It is asymmetrical. The pleasure is front-loaded. The drag is subscription-like. And that is why people can feel richer and become less free at the exact same time. Nothing about the debt amounts by itself explains the outcome. The destination explains it. That is the first proof. Now come to the more respectable side of the room, earned income. This is where people like to imagine they are safer because the money was honest. It came from work. It came from effort. It came from being tired in a socially approved way. Surely that means it will behave better. Nope. A paycheck with no forwarding address is just a more polite emergency. It looks cleaner because you earned it. It disappears the same way if nobody assigned its routes before it landed. This is where a lot of the Japanese money practices people admire are quietly less mystical than they sound. Kakeibo is not powerful because writing in a notebook turns you into a different species. It is powerful because it interrupts the lie that all spending is happening spontaneously and innocently. You name categories. You force visibility. You stop letting money blur into weather. The second the dollar becomes named, it starts becoming routed. That is the real change. And hara hachibu in money terms is not just about eating until 80% full and then stepping away like a serene philosopher who owns only ceramic bowls. The financial version is upstream enough. Stop before the dollar completes its usual trip into total consumption. Slice it before it is felt. Take the 20% before the rest of your identity gets involved. That is why the 80-20 saving pattern matters. Not because 20 is a sacred number, because automation is upstream. If the investment transfer happens after you have already felt wealthy for 3 days, your odds collapse. If it happens before your lifestyle registers the full paycheck, now the dollar has a destination before appetite gets jurisdiction. That is the law again. And multi-nai is not just a pretty cultural phrase people use while pretending a leaking subscription is a moral drama. At its best, it creates offense towards waste. Not shame, a fence.
A recurring charge for something you barely use is not just a minor leak. It is an unrouted dollar finding the nearest drain because no adult in the house assigned it better work. That sounds rude. It is also clarifying. A lot of mystery about why progress feels slow is just $100 here, $40 there, $18 there, all leaving with a cleaner resume than they deserve. The system is not broken. The dollars were homeless, and homeless dollars are unbelievably easy to recruit. This is also where knowing enough becomes a wealth tool. People hear that and think it means giving up ambition. It means something smarter. If you never define enough, every raise becomes fresh prey for the same old habits. The routing code never changes, so a bigger paycheck simply means a larger convoy gets sent to the same addresses. Nicer dinners, softer excuses, faster conveniences, better packaging around the same leak. Lifestyle creep is not just overspending. It is unchanged routing under higher volume. That is why two people can get the same raise and only one of them feels like time opened up. One person increased the amount moving, the other changed where movement defaulted. And that difference compounds so quietly that it barely feels dramatic while it is happening, which is exactly why it works. Employer match is another beautiful example. People describe it as free money, which is fine as a slogan, but the deeper point is that the destination is pre-designed. The money barely gets a chance to become theater. It is routed while still innocent, before your better stories show up, before your tired Friday self starts explaining why this month is unusual, before your brain produces a moving documentary about why this specific couch, this specific trip, this specific upgrade is actually an investment in your emotional infrastructure. Your brain can sell anything if you wait long enough. That is why routing has to happen before the sales pitch begins. Long horizon automation is the same principle with less romance and more power. People think discipline means making the right decision again and again. Real wealth is usually built by making the important decision once, correctly, then reducing how often you are asked to be impressive. That is what automation is, a mercy. A good system is one that stops requiring you to be in a great mood to have a good future. And when you combine these ideas, you get the uncomfortable truth people resist because it feels too simple.
The wealthy outcome and the broke outcome can both be built from money that passed through hands with roughly the same talent, same intelligence, even the same income range. What changes first is not the amount, it is the assignment. One person's dollars are pre-addressed to index funds, debt reduction, reserves, employer match capture, asset acquisition, and lower friction future choices. The others arrive as free-floating civilians in hostile territory. No map, no orders, no air support. And then we call the result a personality difference. Sometimes it is. Often, it is logistics. That is why I do not think the most important split in personal finance is spender versus saver. That split is too flattering to both sides. You can save without routing and still build a beautiful waiting room for money that eventually wanders off. You can earn more without routing and just become a higher capacity distributor for everything trying to sell you relief. The real split is addressed versus unaddressed, assigned versus available, pre-decided versus improvisational. One of the most expensive words in money is later. I will invest later. I will clean this up later. I will automate later. I will think about that card later. Later is where unrouted Letty goes to win, because later means the dollar stays on the belt with no printed label while the rest of life crowds around it making suggestions. And life is very persuasive when the package is still warm. So what should the routing code actually say? For borrowed money, it should answer one boring question before any glamorous question. What productive job is this debt legally, mechanically, and behaviorally assigned to do? Not conceptually, not spiritually, specifically. Will this borrowing acquire or preserve something that outlasts the dopamine? Will it create cash flow, lower unavoidable long-term cost, improve your resilience, or sit inside a structure where time and inflation are helping instead of ambushing you? If not, be careful calling it strategy. It may just be consumption and formalware. For earned income, the routing code should be visible before payday arrives. Emergency reserve gets fed, investment account gets fed, retirement match gets captured, debt payoff lane gets named. Operating money is what remains after the addresses are assigned. That ordering matters, because if your budget begins with what is left after life happens, wealth will always be a leftover project, and leftovers are where big goals go when the week gets annoying.
You do not rise to your values under pressure. You fall to your default routing. That is true in airports. It is true in relationships. And very inconveniently, it is true in your checking account. Now, a fair objection. What if there just is not enough money? That matters. Of course it matters. There are people who are not suffering from bad routing so much as insufficient volume, bad luck, thin margins, medical hits, or a labor market that charges emotional rent on top of financial rent. This framework is not permission to sneer at people under real pressure. But even there, routing still matters, because when margins are thin, misrouting hurts faster. And when margins are better, good routing compounds faster. The rule does not replace structural reality. It explains what happens inside it. In low margin life, routing protects survival. In medium margin life, routing builds slack. In high margin life, routing scales wealth. Same law, different altitude. You can even watch it happen with numbers small enough that nobody gets to hide behind theory. Say $200 shows up at the end of the month. In one life, it arrives without a label. It becomes faster delivery, a dinner upgrade, 2 small impulse buys, and 1 subscription the person barely remembers agreeing to. Nothing looks catastrophic. That is why the system survives. The money did not explode. It dissolved. In the other life, that same 200 already had jobs before it appeared. 100 goes automatically into an index fund. 50 shortens a card balance that was taxing the future. And 50 tops up a cash buffer so next month's surprise does not have to become debt. Still the same 200. Still the same week. But one version bought a brief mood, and the other version quietly bought a different next month. That is routing in its least glamorous and most powerful form. That is also why some high earners remain permanently fragile. People talk about them like cautionary legends. How can someone making that much still feel trapped? Easy. Massive throughput, weak routing. If every extra dollar defaults to obligations that must be maintained, then income growth just expands the machine that now requires feeding. You did not build freedom. You built a larger animal. And larger animals are expensive in winter. By contrast, some people never look flashy because their routing code is doing all the charisma invisibly. The transfer leaves before applause. The asset gets fed before lifestyle gets dressed. The account that matters is boring to talk about, which is probably why it survives. The point is not to become severe. The point is to stop acting surprised by the behavior of unassigned money. An unassigned dollar does what unassigned people do in a noisy city. It follows lighting. It follows convenience. It follows whoever sounded most certain 5 seconds ago. That is not a moral failure. That is a management failure. So if you want one practical shift from all of this, make it smaller than a reinvention. Do not promise yourself a whole new identity by Sunday. Pick one routing decision that happens upstream. 1. Maybe your raise never fully lands in checking. Maybe the employer match finally stops being treated like optional garnish. Maybe the credit card stops being a personality extension and becomes a system with a named payoff lane. Maybe the extra cash from a freelance month gets pre-addressed to an asset bucket before your brain starts writing fan fiction about what you deserve. Maybe you sit down and write the categories properly. Because mystery is expensive, and clarity is cheaper than shame. Whatever it is, do it before the money arrives if you can. That is the secret part people keep skipping. Early. Not heroically. Early. Because once the dollar is in your hand, the room gets crowded. Once it already feels like yours in the emotional sense, every alternative destination starts feeling like a sacrifice. But if the route is set first, then spending less on one thing does not feel like losing. It feels like mail being delivered correctly. And that is what wealthy people are often doing when they look almost boring from the outside. They are not winning by feeling more inspired than you every morning. They are winning because they reduced how many dollars arrive without instructions. Borrowed money. Earned money. Different stories. Same law. The future is not mainly shaped by how dramatic the money move was. It is shaped by whether the destination was fixed before emotion walked into the room. That is why one loan becomes a trap and another becomes leverage. That is why one paycheck becomes progress and another becomes proof that working harder somehow still feels strangely temporary. The paper was never the point. The address was. So the next time money hits your life, do not ask only, how much is this? Ask the question earlier and meaner. Where was this already going before I touched it? Because every dollar is going somewhere,
The only real choice is whether you stamp the label yourself.
And if you start doing that now, quietly, upstream, without waiting to become a different person first, the result is gentler than most people think. You do not wake up one day feeling like a genius. You just notice that fewer dollars keep disappearing into stories that never loved you back. And over time, that feels a lot like breathing room. Not flashy, not cinematic. Better. That is usually how real wealth first arrives, not as a miracle, as correctly forwarded mail.